The UFO and UAP phenomena is complex, tricky, and like an onion. As you peel off the top layer, you find that there are more and more layers below it. Today, to help us with this topic, we have a well-traveled expert, and his name is Preston Dennett. Here is a little more about him.
Preston Dennett began investigating UFOs and the paranormal in 1986 when he discovered that his family, friends, and co-workers were having dramatic unexplained encounters. Since then, he has interviewed hundreds of witnesses and investigated a wide variety of paranormal phenomena. He is a field investigator for the Mutual UFO Network, MUFON, a ghost hunter, a paranormal researcher, and the author of 30 books and more than 100 articles on UFOs and the paranormal. Several of his books have been Amazon UFO bestsellers. His articles have appeared in numerous magazines including Fate, Atlantis Rising, MUFON UFO Journal, Nexus, Paranormal Magazine, UFO Magazine, Phenomena Magazine, Mysteries Magazine, Ufologist, and others. His writing has been translated into several different languages including German, French, Portuguese, Russian, and Icelandic. He has appeared on numerous radio and television programs, including Midnight in the Desert with Art Bell, Coast to Coast, and also the History Channel's Deep Sea UFOs and UFO Hunters and Ancient Aliens. His research has been presented in the LA Times, the LA Daily News, the Dallas Morning News, and other newspapers. He has taught classes on various paranormal subjects and lectures across the United States.
Welcome to High Strangeness, where we ask questions and explore all that is strange and unexpected in our reality.
Welcome to High Strangeness. I'm Tony, and this is a place where we talk about all things strange and unexpected in our reality. Today's episode is a High Strangeness episode. As mentioned in the introduction to this episode, we have on the show today someone who has been in the thick of all things strange since 1986. Today we're going to skim in and out of a couple of his books, his recent books. And so what that means is you're going to get a lot of good information today, but there's no way we're going to cover all of it. So you're going to want to get those books and really check that information out. So lots of information. We'll dive in and out. But I'm so excited today because we have on the show today Preston Dennett, who's been in this forever, like I said. How are you doing, Preston?
I'm doing pretty good. Yeah, not bad at all. How are you?
Awesome. I'm excited to do this and to just to learn from somebody with as much background and information as you have. I think it's wonderful to have you on the show, and I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. So, Preston, where are you joining us from today?
I'm actually from the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Georgia.
And have you always lived out there? Is that somewhere you've moved to in recent years, or?
Relatively recently. I actually was born in Illinois, Chicago area, but one of 6 kids, my family decided to pick up and move to California. So that's really where I grew up, right outside of Los Angeles. But it got too crowded there, too hot, too expensive, too a lot of things.
Yeah.
So just a few years ago, I picked up and went off to the East Coast of the U.S.
Yeah, a lot of people have decided to head out of there for expense and things like that. Beautiful state, just man, tough place to live. Rather, it's great to vacation there, but that's about it for a lot of people that I know. Yeah. So before we get into a lot of this, Preston, I want to start here if we can. So in 1986, family, friends, coworkers were experiencing strange stuff. And I know that kind of got your attention. Can you share for the audience here, like how you even got into all this? Because you've been doing this for 40 years, just about.
Yeah, it's most of my life now. I've been doing this. Never in a million years thought I would be. I was very skeptical. Had no idea that people I knew were having encounters. Well, I can't say no idea because at around age 13, my older brother Mark did come running into the house one evening saying he'd seen a UFO. But I was such a skeptic that I didn't even really listen to him. I didn't want to hear it. Everything changed in 1986. I remember the exact date, November 17. There was a report on the news about a sighting over Alaska. It's actually a really famous case in the UFO community. JAL Airlines, Captain Kenji Torochi, Yeah, well-known case, very well
Yeah.
authenticated. And they did a little news segment on it, which was really very brief, kind of joking. They weren't really taking it all that seriously. But it impressed me because they did show the pilot, Captain Kenji Torochi, and mentioned that he had seen this UFO, he and his crew, for quite some time. Later, of course, I found out how good of a case it is with radar returns, multiple witnesses, and it pacing their plane for many miles. None of that was in the news report, but it interested me enough to ask my brother Mark again what he thought he had seen. And I got a real shock because I don't know what made me ready to listen at this point, but he described a very close up sighting of a metallic disc
Hmm.
hovering not too far away, treetop level, and he chased it in his car.
Hmm.
So he's telling me all of this. I'm like, are you kidding me? He's like, no, no, this happened. And if you don't believe me, ask my friends. They were with me. Phil and Greg were his friends, who I knew. So I did ask them. They confirmed the story. That's what really sent the ball rolling. And I found out that uh, his wife, or soon to be wife, had had encounters as a little girl with little blue beings. Uh, my
Wow.
other brother, his girlfriend, soon to be wife, had a close up sighting with unidentified lights. She also had a friend with her, and I talked to him. And she also had an encounter with gray ETs. That took her a little bit to reveal to me, but she did.
Wow.
And yeah, I had two friends who had encounters. I brought it up at work, got a real shock there. A lady at work had missing time after being chased by a UFO. Another lady, her whole family had seen UFOs, and her daughter was having direct contact. So it literally hit home. And it was a tough adjustment. Took me really a year to sort of wrap my head around all of this, that people I knew were having these encounters, that there was a government cover up. This had been taken seriously for decades by UFO researchers. I joined MUFON in 1988,
Hmm.
became a field investigator, and dove deep, interviewing people formally, recording their interviews, doing firsthand cases. Uh, I did that for about 10 years, writing articles,
Wow.
attending conventions, going on the radio occasionally, and actually a couple of times on TV already. But wrote my first book in 1996 and pretty much never stopped after that. I mean, this became a big part of my life very quickly.
Right. Well, and that's crazy. Like, so many people, all of a sudden, it's either happening or becoming, or you're becoming aware of it. There's no way to walk away from that. You're like, what in the world is going on here? That's
Yeah, it was
amazing.
shocking.
Yeah.
I had no idea. I almost felt scandalized. I was upset about it. I'm like, why did you guys not tell me this? They
Right.
said, well, you would not have believed me, and, which was true, I guess. And kind of made me even more skeptical because I'd been lied to, essentially. This wasn't
Right.
being taught in schools, it wasn't being taken seriously, not really in the media. So, people were the subject of ridicule and skepticism, and there was a lot of confusion and fear and misinformation. So it took me a while to really kind of wade through all that and get a handle on what's going on here.
Yeah. Well, and as a MUFON investigator, shortly after these things were starting to happen, you really did dive in both feet. Because some people will go, wow, let me think about this. But you said, let me investigate this. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I'm not sure why I became so obsessed, honestly, other than it was super interesting and I knew so many people who were having these kinds of experiences. But yeah, super fascinating stuff. I'll never forget my first MUFON investigations because, becoming a field investigator back then, you just basically took a take home test. I thought, well, it's a take home test. How hard could this be? It was hard.
Yeah.
There was a lot of questions on astronomy, meteorology, photography, UFO history, of course. Mind you, I did really well. I missed just two questions. One because it
Wow.
was, but yeah, it was really interesting right off the bat.
Wow, that's incredible. You know, I think to me, this kind of a situation where when, a lot of people get exposed to this kind of a thing in a gradual way, or it happens to them or one person, but for it to happen all around you is pretty incredible, which I think is really neat. I can't see how you wouldn't be like, you know what, I got to figure this out. So there you go, right? That started it all for you.
Yeah, and once you're in, you're kind of a member for life, so to speak.
Right,
It's
right.
hard to extricate yourself from this. You'll certainly, you might not become a full-time investigator or something like that, but once you know about it, it's you can't unknow this stuff.
Yeah, yeah. And, maybe we'll get into this throughout our discussion today, but the variations of different entities is very interesting to me. So I do think I have a question there about that as we get going. But for everybody else out there who's listening and watching, I want to just say that here we go, right? We have now approached the edge of the rabbit hole and we're about to jump in. And Preston's going to help us. He's going to take us there. And we're going to do this through review of some of his information in some of his books. So let's start here, Preston, with your first, or the book that I'm going to start with first, which is Not From Here, Selected UFO Articles, Volume 5. And my first question to you is, there are 5 volumes in this series. And can you talk just a minute about what a person might find as they move through volumes 1 through 5 in these books?
Well, they're pretty comprehensive. I really wanted to give the reader a broad base of knowledge with each volume. So it will cover everything from sightings to landings to humanoid encounters, crash retrievals, a history of sightings, even back to early times. But I will say that the series of books kind of specializes in uncovering lesser known avenues, areas that perhaps a lot of researchers haven't touched or are just a little bit offbeat or different or controversial in some way. For example, I think the first volume I did a chapter on Phone Call from an Alien, is the title,
Mm,
which sounds crazy. I mean, people receiving phone calls from ETs
yeah.
sounds a little, unbelievable,
Yeah.
just to be frank. But Ray Fowler, he's a very well respected researcher, covered a case with this with his star client, Betty Andreasen. And that's a very well authenticated case. And of course, Bud Hopkins, arguably one of the leading researchers in terms of onboard experiences, also had a case like this, where one of his clients, one of the people he was working with who was having experiences, was receiving these very odd phone calls with what sounded like a foreign language.
Mm,
And what got me interested is I got my own case from a guy in upstate New York who had his cell phone ring. It said no number on it. It made a tone it can't make. And finally, he picked it up. He was driving, kept ringing. He picked it up and it said, "We are coming soon. Be prepared." Uh,
what?
so
Wow.
I found a good dozen cases like this. But really, I'm covering so many different topics.
Yeah.
UFOs over graveyards. That's another one that really surprised me. I did not know that was a thing. But J. Allen Hynek has cases, Jim and Coral Lorenzen, of course, Raymond Fowler, most of the major researchers. These are not just sightings. These are cases where these craft are landing, humanoids are being seen. There's
Hmm.
something about graveyards that is absolutely attracting them. I did one
Interesting.
on UFOs over prisons all over the world. I found probably 30 cases. These kinds of patterns, UFOs over mines, that was another real surprise. For example, Colorado is the leading producer of copper in the United States. Almost all those copper mines down in Arizona have had some really dramatic encounters. But I found cases over gold mines, silver mines, diamond mines. There was a case of a uranium mine, Karnes City, Texas, where a UFO came down and sent down beams of light, scared the workers half to death. I mean, some of them were actually weeping.
Yeah.
And when they went to dig up this vein of uranium, it had been spent. been turned to white chalk, rendered inactive. So that was one of many cases where they actually physically affect these.
Yeah.
But again, humanoids being seen. So all these different aspects. It's super interesting. I did one of the UFO.
Mm.
I mean, you name it. If there's an aspect that hadn't been covered, I dove deep into it.
Well, that's one of the things. And as we talk today, the second book that we cover, specifically, I pulled out a few questions that were very unique circumstances that follow along with what you're saying. So I'm excited for that. So it sounds like not only are you doing that in your series, 1 through 5, but in some of your other works too, because the second book that we're going to talk about is got some pretty unique stuff in there too. So I'm excited to hear a little bit more about that. Very cool. Well, okay, so with this first book, you've got 10 chapters in here, and I just want to open the door and lightly talk about maybe 4 or 5 different things in that first book uh, that we're going to talk about. And the first thing you bring up right in the beginning, chapter 1, is UFO swarms, and that they happen, or they're kind of rare, but they teach us something about the phenomena. And I'd like to give you a minute to just kind of talk about that, if you would.
Yeah, I found this super interesting because there was an incident in Farmington, New Mexico that really got me thinking about all of this. And that was in 1950. Farmington is a pretty small town, some 3,000, 4,000 people. And on March 17, they had this wave of sightings that didn't involve one or two objects or 10 or 20, but literally hundreds. This was a
Wow.
daytime encounter, early morning. It stopped traffic in the streets. Kids came running out of the schools. People came running out of their businesses, out of their homes. A good half the town saw this, including police officers, the mayor, the newspaper office. These were your typical kind of glowing craft, oval shaped. Some were larger than others. One appeared to be letting out, releasing smaller objects, and they put on what UFO researchers call a display. I mean, this is clearly a kind of publicity stunt. They wanted to be seen.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, UFOs are somewhat evasive. By that, I mean you can't just go outside and expect to see one at any given moment. And often they'll just start off or they're appearing only at night, well, largely at night. Not in this case. It was clear they wanted to be seen. This went on for almost an hour. These were darting at right angles, uh, whirling around each other, dancing around, zipping across the sky. Were photographed as well, as you might expect,
Mm.
because while they did go away, they came back again later that day. So I was thinking about this. I'm like, this sounds like a unique incident. Offhand, I couldn't think of any other case involving hundreds of objects. But I got my own case then. On June 14, 1992, there was a huge wave of sightings over Topanga Canyon. Ironically, where I grew up, never saw anything. Turned out a lot of people were seeing stuff in this area. It is absolutely what I would call a hot spot or a flap area. But on that summer of 1992, on June 14th in particular, something happened because people started calling the police office, the local newspaper, and it was the editor of the newspaper who actually called me up and said, I want you to investigate this. And he did that because I had written an article for the newspaper uh, some years earlier, 1988, thereabouts. And I grew up in that area, so I knew a lot of people. And sure enough, I found a lot of witnesses to that night.
Wow.
And most of these people were seeing one or two UFOs, some three or four. But I found a couple who lived high on the canyon in the mountains, about 2,000 feet, overlooking both the ocean. This is right, I should say, Topanga is located west of LA, right on the coast of the ocean there, very near Malibu and Santa Monica. It's kind of sandwiched between there. And this couple, I call them Daniel and Catherine, had a good view of the ocean, LA, all a 360-degree view. And very early that evening, they saw about 10 objects rise up from behind a ridge, from below, which is kind of interesting. Normally, when someone sees a UFO, it's coming from above or the horizon. This was coming from down below.
Hmm.
They couldn't see precisely where, but definitely from below the ridge. And when a second group of objects came up, and then a third, each, 10, 15, they started counting them because this went on for the next 2 hours. And she started counting them, the wife. She counted about 200.
Oh my
Now,
gosh.
yeah, that's a lot. It's funny. I went up there, I looked at the spot. I actually did get another witness from the other side of the ridge later who saw them coming up out of this big bright flash of light. And I ended up talking to a good 100 witnesses.
Yeah.
Uh, but what was really interesting is the husband was there and he's like, well, I don't know if it was 200. It could have been closer to 100. And that caused me to burst out laughing,
Right.
rudely, I'm afraid, because to me, 100, 200 is, yeah, there's a difference there, but still an awful lot of objects.
Yeah.
And he looked at me and he says, well, she's probably right. She was counting them, I wasn't. So that was another case. And I started scouring the literature, and I didn't find nearly as many cases of this as I thought, but I found quite a few. I
Yeah.
mean, there was one at a college in Syracuse in 1947 where an astronomer was looking through a telescope, the university telescope, and was seeing one object after another. He called in a couple of students so that they could verify it too. And yeah, counted about 100 objects. So what I found, for me, the takeaway from this is that there are a lot more of these things out there than
Yeah.
might be immediately obvious or apparent. So I think that is really the big takeaway here. But the other is that they, yeah, will sometimes put on displays that they're doing what amounts to a publicity campaign, announcing
Right.
their presence.
Well, and it's interesting because a lot of people try to assign this to drones, and it's like, hello, there's not, people are not going to send out 100 and some drones like that. And then this is like Foo Fighters, right? I mean, their drones weren't around back during World War II either. So, yeah, really interesting. That now, can I ask you? I want to go back to the California example that you shared, where they thought they were coming out from below. Would that have been near the ocean, or was there something opening up, like some kind of a portal, and they were coming out? Was there any thought about where that was coming from for those people?
Well, they certainly wondered about it.
Yeah.
Uh, Daniel and Catherine couldn't see behind the ridge. I later did get contacted by someone who was on the other side and saw bright flashes of light and multiple objects coming out of this flash of light. So, I've talked to a lot of contactees, some who have really extensive and fully conscious contact, and they tell me the ETs can travel interdimensional,
Mm,
basically open up a kind of a gate, if you will, or I mean, you could call it a portal. Not a huge fan of that term because I think it can be,
yeah.
but traveling interdimensionally. I will say I did interview a witness who was on that night down by the water and saw a very large craft come out of the water, accompanied by a dozen or so smaller objects. He was not the only witness. And this larger object and all the smaller objects darted very quickly northwest up the coastline and were gone in literally seconds. I mean, he got maybe 30-second view of this, but he saw them coming out of the water. And I do
Mm,
have another case on Catalina Island where it was essentially the same thing, and that involved about 150 objects.
wow.
So, yeah, there's something going on in this area.
Yeah. And
Uh,
especially the Catalina Island there. That's there. There's been a number of different people saying that they think something is down there in that little trench down there. So that would make sense if they're coming from somewhere down there. Crazy.
yeah. Well, one thing I do know is there's a lot of USOs, unidentified submersible objects.
Yeah.
So, which makes perfect sense considering our planet is mostly water.
Very true. Very true. Wow. Okay. Well, people, there you go. That first chapter, UFO swarms, right? Where you're going to hear some of this, and I love the fact that we get to hear about things that are not really out there. I mean, they're out there if you research them, but like we have a number of different sightings that people always talk about, and there are ones like this that people go, "Really, that happened?" And I think that's so cool that you're sharing that and bringing that kind of information out. Very good. Well, one of the other chapters you talk about calling UFOs, and it's interesting to me because right now with Jake Barber and the Skywatchers group, there's summoning or inviting orbs and UAP to come, and then of course you have Stephen Greer who's been doing his CE5 for a number of years. This when you dive into calling UFOs, is this what you're referring to? Is this connection to invite these these entities from some other dimension or something like that? Is that where you're coming from with this?
Yeah, essentially, because I think there's a tendency to look upon UFO encounters as completely random event, and we know that's not true. I mean, there are like going through this whole series that I wrote of the Not From Here series. There are a number of what we would call UFO attractors. Uh, they're very much attracted to technological installations, military bases, nuclear power plants, this sort of thing. So it's
Yeah.
obviously not completely random. But there is this category of encounters which are essentially human initiated, or so it would appear, where through some action of our own, you can provoke a UFO into an appearance.
Right.
And I'm not sure this is something I would call guaranteed by any means. It's not like you can just do something and absolutely for sure have a sighting. But I started, this is nothing new. Stephen Greer certainly popularized it and, basically kind of developed a series, what he calls the contact protocols,
Right.
and really kind of brought this to the forefront of UFO research, which excellent, work on that. I have to give him kudos because that I think is one of the real benefits of this category of encounters
Yeah.
is that it's not random, and you can absolutely, instead of studying, you craft, the phenomenon, for lack of a better word. It's not my favorite word for this, but study it firsthand. So that alone makes these cases super important. And I got a really, really good couple of early cases involving this, which is what actually got me interested in this, which was actually before CSETI ever formed. There's a number of contactees who've been doing this, by the way. Sisto Paz Wells
Hmm.
from Peru has been doing this for quite some time. And there are others. I found a number of early cases of people who were basically calling UFOs down through, I guess you would say, just reaching out mentally, telepathically. And I think that's the key here because ETs, as a general rule, do communicate telepathically. I say ETs
Right.
because I do think that's what we're dealing with here. I
Yeah.
know everyone has their own take on this and theories, but by far the most popular is that we're dealing with people, extraterrestrials, people like us, very much like us. But I got this amazing case when a gentleman who worked with my father, who was in the movie business, told him, because my father and this guy, Arnie Weiler, worked as a set director for NBC and in May of 1983 had gone down to Santa Monica, the George Page Museum, the La Brea Tar Pits, to do a stunt for NBC where they set up what's called pitchell lights. These are very large lights that you can attach to a computer and flash various patterns. These were colored lights. They were basically creating a peacock's tail for the NBC logo, and it would light up and it was supposed to stand up and, of course, to attract attention. Well, it attracted attention all right, but not the kind I don't think they were looking for this kind of attention because as soon as they turned it on, three objects came zooming down and hovered right close by, a few hundred feet away. And the guy I interviewed, Arnie Weiler, turned to the guy who was really in charge of all of this. His name is Rick Liebert. He was the technician. And he said, "Look, what are those?" And Rick Liebert was very casual. It's like, "Oh, UFOs. I've seen them many times. They have a tendency to show up when I do this kind of thing." And off they went very
Crazy.
quickly. I think the idea here is that these craft came down to check out what looked like a landed UFO. Pure speculation, right? Or maybe it was a recognition. I don't know. I can only speculate. But hearing this from Arnie, I'm like, "You got to put me in touch with Rick Liebert. This has happened before. I want to know." And he says, "Sure, I'm pretty sure he'll talk to you." Turned out he was a pretty high level guy. He's met many really uh, famous people, I should say, in the music industry. He was part of a major rock radio station. And it was some years earlier, in 1978, that he was doing a publicity stunt down in San Diego for a major radio station. And this involved setting up a green argon laser on top of what was then the tallest building in San
Hmm.
Diego, California, a bank building. And they called up the FAA, of course, to get permission to do this. Uh, and this laser would play in beat to various rock songs, Pink Floyd, Rolling Stones, and so forth. It was a publicity stunt for
Yeah.
the station. So they turned this thing on, and he said, I spoke with Rick directly. There was 10 people or so up on the top of the building there, and they turned on this laser, and it's shooting off and creating a spectacle. And almost immediately, a very, very large, totally silent V-shaped craft came swooping down over the top of the building. Says couldn't tell quite how high it was, 50 or 100 feet, because he didn't know how big this thing was. It was massive. It covered the whole skyline kind of right above them. They were in a boxed area with walls around the top of the building, so they couldn't quite see over the edge easily. This thing came down, it had lights along each end of the V, and way up next to it, well, not next to it, but up higher up, was another one. This was significant to me because I'd come to realize, having interviewed a number of people, when somebody sees one UFO, there's very likely another one hanging out. They usually come in pairs or
Yeah.
more. So that was another case, and that's what really got me interested in CE5s.
It's crazy. Do you think it's going to reshape the way some investigations are going lately? Especially because it's being talked about so much more with this Sky Watchers and stuff like that situation that's going on. Do you see, that kind of shaping the way investigators try to look at this going forward for a little bit?
Well, it certainly has great potential to do so, and I think it has already to some degree,
Yeah.
because it does allow pretty much anyone to have the opportunity to see a UFO, but particularly UFO researchers. And again, moves you out of just studying passively UFO reports, and you can actively interact with UFOs themselves. And what I like about this is, yeah, I think it has such great potential to move from maybe beyond just a simple sighting. Because if you could get one of these things to land, and if you could get one of these things to open the door, in ETs to come out, I mean, this could honestly lead to full on interactive relationship with
Yeah.
ETs, open official contact, if you will. And
That
we
would change
haven't quite
everything.
seen that, but I think it has the potential to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to say that would change everything. And I think it's interesting. I don't mean to keep going back to the Jake Barber thing. It's just in the news a lot lately, or it's in podcasts a lot lately. They're suggesting now that they can, with almost 100% efficiency, get a response. We'll see if that's true, but that's what they're
Yeah.
saying.
I
Wow,
have
if
to
that's
say I'm
true.
skeptical of that
Right. Yeah. I mean, how? Wow.
because there's some of the statements they're saying that, with all due respect, I do give kudos to anyone who enters this field. It's very controversial,
Yeah.
but I am highly suspect of a lot of the people coming out of the intelligence sector, uh, simply because that sector has a long, heinous history of lying,
Yes.
covering up, and providing disinformation. And it's my understanding, no, we can't shoot these things down. You cannot fool an ET into thinking, that we ourselves are ET. They're highly, highly, highly advanced. I think
Yeah.
almost all UFO researchers will agree upon that, and certainly contactees. I just don't see that as being credible. This is my
Right.
assessment, uh, just based on my own research and the people I've talked to. So I do have questions about some of the statements they're releasing, but yeah, I do think it's an important.
Yeah. No, I appreciate you sharing that too, because I think it is important for people to really take a good look at this because, we've got everybody from a Stephen Greer to Elizondo, and some of those guys have lived in that government space for so long that are they being honest or are they, pushing a message? It's hard to say. It really is
Yeah,
hard
well,
to
there's
say.
no doubt there's disinformation.
Yeah.
We we know this,
Yes.
and it's pretty clear that the media is somewhat biased. They love a good, scary, lurid, fear-based story,
Right.
and I kind of bought into that as an early researcher. I'm like, well, this is horrific.
Yeah.
I pretty quickly reversed my opinions talking to people who had this experience. I don't think it's nefarious. I don't think ETs are here to hurt, harm, scare, take over, anything like that.
Yeah.
Quite the opposite, actually. Uh, so,
So I
yeah,
was
there's
going
a
to
lot
ask you,
of push and pull in this subject.
let me ask you this question. I'm just curious as you're talking about this. And if you're not comfortable saying it, that's fine. But I'm just curious, do you side more on Stephen Greer and where he's coming from, or is there somebody else out in this space that's maybe hitting the news and out there that you're saying, you know what, my research points me to what he or she says more? Is there anybody like that you're willing to share, or are
Oh,
you still
yeah.
kind of looking at it? Yeah.
Yeah, I do have, a handful of researchers I really respect and whose research reflects my own.
Yeah.
I've really focused a lot on people who've had direct contact. So I think that is important because we're not going to get the truth about UFOs from our intelligence agencies, our government, who have, like I said, a long dismal history of not being truthful. We're
Right.
certainly not going to get it from pundits on TV or scientists who are basically expressing speculative opinions. I've met Stephen Greer a
Hmm.
number of times. I've talked to him. We had some pretty in-depth, heated discussions about some aspects where we disagree a little bit.
Yeah.
I think he's done some really important research. Uh, this whole C SETI, pushing the whole CE5 movement was really, I think, a benefit to UFO research and his push towards disclosure. Somebody had to do it, and
Yeah.
he really spearheaded that as well. But no, I don't agree with everything he says. I would point to researchers like Kathleen Marden or Barbara Lamb, Timothy Good, Michael Schratt. These are people I love the early research, Jim and Cora Lorenzen.
Mm.
uh, Donald Kehoe to me is a huge hero in this field, even though he really didn't talk a lot about humanoids. He
Right.
single-handedly kind of took on the UFO cover-up when no one else was. But Leo Sprinkle, Dr. James McDonald, J. Allen Hynek, of course. But I think if you really want to know what's going on with the UFO field, you need to talk to the contactees.
Right.
That's why I like Barbara Lamb, because she's just letting these people speak for themselves. That's exactly what I'm trying to do. I don't push a narrative. I don't edit or censor people's accounts.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to get to the truth of this. And almost everything we know about ET contact is coming from one source, and that's those who've had contact. So
Right.
that's where I'm really looking for answers.
Well, it's interesting. I had the opportunity, and I was lucky enough to get an interview with somebody around episode 61 to 3 for myself. 61, 2, and 3. We did a 3-part on a person who experienced an abduction and has been, and he wrote a book on it. And it was an incredible story, right? I mean, and his conviction with the way he described the things he experienced. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Like when you hear somebody talk about these things, there's a power behind it, and they're not theorizing. They're just telling you, this is what happened to me. And that's pretty powerful.
Oh yeah, yeah. I remember when I first started interviewing people, it was quite intense. A lot different than reading a book.
Right.
And eventually, that inspired me to go out in the field myself. And I had a few sightings. I did join CSETI. I was part
Hmm.
of the member of the LA charter group. And we went out on the first night and had a sighting of an anomalous light. And that was fairly regular. I mean, I would say every fourth or fifth time something would happen.
Yeah.
But it's real hard to do to stay late from 1 a.m. to 4 a.m. Out there in the cold. That something comes down this time. but
Right.
but yeah,
Yeah.
when it did,
Amazing. Well, in your book too, you mentioned some things about the twins connection, and you also talk about this alien book of technology. Would you take a minute and just share a little bit about that? I think that stuff was fascinating, just really different. I hadn't heard it before, so really cool.
yeah. Well, the twin connection was something that fascinated me very early on because I had interviewed a lady who was pregnant with twins and lost one in utero, and the doctors told her, this is very rare. What happened to you? The chances of you carrying this other twin is one in some million. So please be prepared for that. And this is when she started having this UFO land right outside her home. I
Wow.
interviewed her and her husband. I actually slept in their backyard, hoping to see something, because the UFOs would come over a period of couple of days and then stop and then come back. And she does remember being pulled on board and then being very interested in her pregnancy. Uh, when she went to the doctor, actually, the nurse came in and told her privately. She says, "I really shouldn't be telling you this. This is against,"
Wow.
which is, she said, "This is unusual. I've never seen this happen before." And of course, the pregnancy did go to full term. I met the son. He's wonderful. He's very precocious and psychic, and started talking about seeing angels. He called them angels, it turned out, is what he was trying to say.
Mm.
And called out the name of his twin brother, who he did not even know he was a twin. They had
Wow.
named both the twins before they were born. So that got me thinking that, because I started to see a high incidence of twins among the contactee population. And whenever I'd interview someone, I'd be like, do you happen to be a twin? And a number of them told me, well, yeah, my mother was pregnant with twins, but only one came out. There
Hmm.
was this going on as well. Of course, I interviewed a guy who was a twin, and his twin brother, fraternal twin, also was having encounters. And I started looking through the literature, and of course, I found the Allagash case by Raymond Fowler, which involved the twins of Jim and John Wiener. And they said flat out the ETs seemed very interested in the fact that they were twins. And there's Philip and, gosh, what's his name? Philip and John Kinsella.
Yes. I just
Uh,
interviewed one of them the other day.
yeah, they're twins, and
Wow.
Audrey and Debbie Hewins. And I found quite a number of people. It seems a slightly higher of incidence of twins than in the normal population. And I also found it
Amazing.
interesting because a lot of people who described seeing ETs described them as looking like twins, very much like each other. Could have been twins, they would say.
Really?
And there's, of course, a whole interest in genetics on the part of the ETs. Or they're collecting genetics from people, we know this, but also plants and animals. So
Interesting.
there's something going on here that I think deserves more attention. We'll
Yeah.
say there's a few cases where people have been taken on board and met their own twin, met their sibling who was living with the ETs.
Wow.
So that is like, wow, yeah, that is what really prompted me to write that chapter. I couldn't find
That's
anything else, no literature on this really at all.
That's fascinating.
So I'm hoping that this is opening the door for someone to dive a little deeper, but super interesting.
Yeah, and
And
yeah, I mean, I haven't. That was the best thing, because I'm looking through your material and I'm going, my gosh, I hadn't heard this before. That is really cool. Really
yeah,
cool.
and another thing, which this I put this as the last chapter because it was my favorite, well, alien books,
Yeah,
because of course we all know the Betty and Barney Hill case. That's the case that really broke this subject wide open in 1961 when they had an encounter in New Hampshire, in the White
yeah.
Mountains. She was shown a book. She was given a book by the ETs, and
I
they said,
re-
"This you can have." She's like, "This is my proof. Can I have something?" And they said, "Here. What do you want?" She picked this little shining blue metallic book. I said, "You can't read it." And she's like, "Well, that's not the point. It's proof. It's proof that this happened to me." And they were letting
Preston,
me go.
I forgot all about that. That's right, Preston. I forgot all about that part of that account.
And
Thank you.
I
Yeah,
always wondered about it because she was exiting the craft. Barney was actually on the ramp and walking down, and she's behind him. And they take the book back. She was furious. She's like, "That's my proof." And they said, "Well, that's the point.
yeah.
We can't give this to you. It could cause problems and so forth." And she was furious, naturally. But it got me
Wow.
thinking, this little thin blue book with symbols in it. How interesting is that? And I immediately, of course, thought of Betty Andreasen. She was also given a blue book by the ETs, which they let her keep in her home for 2 weeks. Her
Hmm.
daughter saw it, and she described it almost exactly the same way. Glowing white pages with weird symbols inside of it, and got a little bit more of a handle on what it was, which was spiritual wisdom of some kind. So they did put her under hypnosis to try to get some details and had no luck getting anywhere with that.
Right.
So I started diving deep into this, and I found a number of cases. Whitley Strieber had this happen twice, described it the same way, like a jeweled cover, and he did get some idea of what the contents were, which was all about the history of humanity and spirituality and religion and how
Hmm.
it evolved. Super interesting. Jeff Selver, a contactee from Canada, same darn thing. This jeweled, kind of bluish book, and he couldn't remember the contents for a long time until he kind of meditated and did hypnosis as well. And as you might expect, it was all about psychic development, the power of love, how to levitate, the importance of being moral, really the same kind of contents other people are describing. For me, the real breakthrough was when I interviewed a lady by the name, I ended up writing a whole book on her. Love her.
Hmm.
She is a fully conscious contactee, not through the lens of fear, not through hypnosis, fully conscious, a lifetime of encounters, worked directly with the ETs, was taught extensive scientific and spiritual knowledge. I'm working on a sequel right now. But at any rate, out of the blue, I'm interviewing her, and I'm like, "Don't suppose you've ever been given a book?" I'm not sure she would have offered this information because her story is so extensive. It's hard to get it all.
Yeah.
Uh, and some of it's, a little different from what other people are describing. But like this, an alien book, who would think? She's like, "Well,
Wow.
actually, as a matter of fact, yes, I do have one. And it was much smaller when I was a kid, but over the years it's grown." And she described it in the same way. She said almost like an emerald or a sapphire surface, not quite metal, something else. She's not sure what. Glowing pages that can project holographic images, interact mentally, telepathically with you, play music even, full of
Whoa.
aphorisms and scientific knowledge and all kinds of subjects. She actually once tried to sneak it off the craft. Huge trouble with the ET. Refused to give it back to her for a couple of weeks as punishment, and told her, you know better than this. If someone else were to get hold of something like this, it would prove dangerous for us, for you, and for who's ever trying to use this thing. I
Wow.
found so many cases of this. When I put in this book, I got some people responding saying, "I'm so glad you did this. I had this experience too." I know you're telling the truth because this is exactly what happened to me. So that
Holy cow.
was so interesting for me.
Yeah, and the fact that you're able to find other people having this as well, that for some reason they're not talking so much about it, but when you bring it up, they're like, okay, yeah, you're saying something that's right because I experienced this. That's amazing to me.
Yeah, I love corroboration and confirmation.
Yeah. Preston, very cool. Thank you for sharing that. The alien book, that's amazing. And really, I think one of those things that I think people are going to want to read more about it for sure, because, yeah, that's pretty powerful. And then when you brought it up about the Betty and Barney Hill, it was like I had forgotten that was part of that account. And there it was. So very, very interesting. Very interesting. Okay, so once again, everybody out there, a lot of information in this book. We just skimmed off the top a little bit. So you're going to want to really dive into all of that. There are 10 chapters in that book, and that's only the 5th of 5 volumes. Oh no, he did not just stop the episode here. Yes, I did. Sorry about that. But hey, join us back on Thursday for part 2 of this episode and to get more information on the second book. See you soon.
Thank you for listening to High Strangeness. This was a glance at some of the strange that exists in our reality.